Persia did not survive because it was lucky. It survived because it learned something most civilizations never did: how to absorb shock without losing identity. From the very beginning, the Iranian plateau was not an easy land. Harsh mountains, dry plains, limited water, and constant invasion routes forced its people to think differently. Where river civilizations depended on predictable floods, Persia learned resilience. This geography created societies that valued endurance over comfort. They valued structure over chaos and long-term systems over short-term dominance. One of Persia's earliest advantages was not military strength, but organizational intelligence. While neighboring civilizations centralized power in one city or one ruler, Persian systems were distributed. Power was delegated, monitored, and corrected. This meant that even when a capital fell, the civilization did not collapse. Administration continued, trade continued, culture continued. Another critical factor was Persia's relationship with diversity. Instead of enforcing a single identity, Persian rulers allowed multiple languages, religions, and customs to coexist. This was not kindness, it was strategy. By letting conquered regions keep their traditions, Persia reduced rebellion and increased productivity. Persian power also came from infrastructure. Roads, postal systems, and standardized administration created an empire that functioned even without direct royal presence. Water management became one of Persia's most underestimated weapons. Persians engineered underground channels that delivered water steadily without evaporation. Persian military strength was not based only on numbers, but on discipline. Elite units were designed to project inevitability rather than chaos. Religion in Persia functioned differently. Belief structures emphasized moral choice, truth, order, and responsibility, aligning perfectly with governance. Even when Persia fell to foreign conquerors, something unusual happened. The conquerors began behaving like Persians. This was cultural dominance through utility. What truly separated Persia from other civilizations was memory. It survived in language, customs, administration, and worldview. Over thousands of years, Persia proved a rare historical pattern. Persia is not just history, it is continuity disguised as change. What made Persia unusually durable was its relationship with time. Most empires chased expansion. Persia invested in longevity. Decisions were made with the assumption that rulers would change. Persia's elite class was not defined only by bloodlines, but by competence. Administrators, engineers, and scribes formed a professional backbone that insulated the state. Another silent strength was Persia's command over narrative control. Rather than presenting itself as a destroyer, Persia framed its rule as restoration of order. Persia also mastered economic circulation. Instead of extracting wealth to a single center, resources were redistributed. This created predictability, a rare luxury. Crucially, Persia never tied its survival to a single ideology. When belief systems changed, Persia adapted without collapsing. The civilization learned to wear new masks without losing its face. Foreign domination did not erase Persia, it stored it underground. Language preserved memory. Poetry preserved ethics. Rituals preserved identity. Persia's resilience also came from its ability to balance fear and trust. People fear randomness more than harshness. Persia understood that stable rules create calmer populations. Unlike empires that glorified rulers, Persia glorified order itself. Kings were symbols, not the system. When symbols fell, the system endured. Across centuries, Persia functioned less like an empire and more like an operating system, compatible with different rulers, adaptable to new inputs, and resilient under pressure. To understand Persia is to understand a rare historical truth. Civilizations do not survive by refusing change. They survive by controlling how change enters. One of Persia's most underestimated strengths was its control of scale. Instead of forcing uniform solutions, Persian governance accepted that scale itself was a problem to be managed. Persia treated geography not as an obstacle, but as an asset. Mountains became defense systems. Rivers became logistics channels. Roads were arteries for information. Another quiet advantage was Persia's psychological patience. It did not rush to destroy enemies who could be neutralized by time. The goal was irreversible outcomes. Persian rulers understood that people tolerate hierarchy if dignity is preserved. Local leaders were retained. Traditions were acknowledged. This reduced humiliation. The empire also invested heavily in symbolic stability. Architecture was used to communicate order. When people repeatedly see stability, they begin to believe instability is abnormal. Persia's military philosophy was defensive at its core. Garrisons existed to hold space, not terrorize it. Violence was a tool, not an identity. Education in Persia was not centralized, but directional. Values such as duty and honesty were reinforced. This created cultural self-regulation. Persia also mastered succession without collapse. Power transitions were ritualized. The empire trained itself to survive leadership failure. What truly separates Persia from failed empires is this: it never confused dominance with immortality. It assumed decline was inevitable and planned for survival beyond it. In the end, Persia teaches a counterintuitive lesson. The strongest civilizations are those that outlast attention. Persia optimized for memory, structure, and quiet endurance. Persia's real innovation was institutional trust. Authority did not rely on constant surveillance or fear, but on predictable systems. Taxes were standardized, courts were consistent. The empire understood that power must be legible. Laws were written, displayed, and translated. When people understand the rules, they spend less energy resisting them. Persia separated identity from obedience. Subjects were not required to emotionally love the empire, only to function within it. Loyalty was procedural, not emotional. Economic integration mattered more than conquest. Regions were tied together through trade incentives. Once livelihoods depend on imperial stability, rebellion becomes self-destructive. The empire refined the idea of distributed intelligence. Information flowed upward from local administrators who understood their regions better than distant rulers ever could. Persia avoided cultural absolutism. It never assumed its way of life was universally superior. By refusing to moralize domination, it avoided ideological backlash. Even punishment followed strategic restraint. Collective punishment was rare. Targeted accountability preserved fear where necessary while protecting the innocent majority. Persia mastered the use of time as a weapon. Delays, negotiations, and prolonged pressure often replaced immediate force. When enemies exhaust themselves, victory costs less. Infrastructure was not vanity, it was policy. Roads, storage systems, and standardized measurements reduced friction across distances. Lower friction increases loyalty. The empire treated rebellion as a failure of administration. This diagnostic mindset led to reform instead of endless retaliation. Fixing causes prevented repetition. Persia also practiced selective visibility. The emperor was distant enough to feel untouchable, yet present enough to feel real. Mystery created reverence. Foreign elites were absorbed, not erased. By incorporating rival nobility into imperial structures, Persia turned potential threats into stakeholders. The empire invested in continuity over brilliance. No single leader was allowed to become larger than the system. This prevented catastrophic collapse. Persia's decline was gradual, not explosive. Even in weakening, it transmitted administrative DNA into later civilizations. True power leaves templates behind. This is why historians still study the Achaemenid Empire, not for spectacle, but for structure. Its greatest achievement was proving that domination does not require destruction. Persia understood something most empires never learned. Scale changes human psychology. Instead of amplifying force, Persia amplified coordination. Control was maintained through predictability, not intensity. When punishment is rare but certain, fear becomes internalized. Persia avoided constant crackdowns. The empire treated religion as a stabilizer, not a weapon. Faith was allowed to anchor communities locally, while the state stayed ideologically flexible. Persia recognized that identity hardens under attack. By not attacking identity, it prevented radicalization. Most people resist only when forced to defend who they are. Its administrative language avoided extremes. Orders were neither vague nor absolute. This allowed officials discretion while preserving accountability. The empire invested heavily in logistics over heroics. Wars were won before battles began through supply planning. Soldiers fight better when hunger and pay are predictable. Persia minimized symbolic humiliation of enemies. Defeated leaders were often spared or repurposed. Humiliation creates martyrs. Absorption creates collaborators. Time horizons were long. Decisions were evaluated not by immediate gain, but by second and third-order effects. Short-term dominance was sacrificed for long-term stability. The empire quietly standardized reality, weights, measures, calendars. When people share the same units of life, coordination becomes subconscious. Standardization is invisible power. Persia also mastered bureaucratic memory. Records outlived individuals. This continuity prevented institutional amnesia, a common cause of collapse after leadership changes. It treated borders as permeable zones, not hard walls. Trade and migration were regulated, not eliminated. Soft borders reduce pressure that hard borders concentrate. Persia rarely rushed to destroy threats. It observed, tested, and waited. Many enemies collapsed internally before Persia had to act. Patience saved resources. Internal dissent was mapped, not ignored. Complaints were signals, not nuisances. This feedback loop allowed early correction before unrest escalated. The empire understood optics. Strength was displayed selectively, never constantly. Over-display cheapens authority. Scarcity increases it. Most importantly, Persia treated governance as engineering, not ideology. Systems were adjusted when they failed. Pride did not override pragmatism. Persia understood that distance erodes loyalty faster than ideology. To solve this, it reduced the psychological distance. Messengers and reporting systems were designed so no region ever felt forgotten. Power was layered, not concentrated. Local authorities handled daily governance. Regional governors handled coordination, and the center focused only on systemic stability. The empire avoided micromanagement. Rules defined outcomes, not methods. This allowed different regions to solve problems using local knowledge instead of waiting for distant approval. Persia treated corruption as a design flaw, not a moral failure. Systems were built so abuse was hard to hide and easy to detect, reducing the need for constant moral policing. Officials were rotated deliberately. No one stayed long enough to build personal kingdoms, but not so briefly that they became careless. Stability came from rhythm, not permanence. Taxes were framed as participation, not extraction. Predictable rates and clear purposes reduced resentment. Uncertainty creates anger faster than high cost. The empire separated symbolic authority from operational authority. Kings represented continuity. Administrators handled mechanics. This protected the system from individual incompetence. Persia avoided total victories. Crushing enemies completely removes incentives for cooperation. Partial defeat leaves room for negotiation and reintegration. Information traveled upward as fast as commands traveled downward. This symmetry prevented blind rule. Empires collapse when leaders only hear praise. Military force was modular. Units were adaptable rather than rigid, allowing responses to different terrains without redesigning the whole army. Persia normalized obedience by making it boring. When governance feels routine, rebellion feels disruptive. Ritual was meaningful because it was rare. Failure was documented, not erased. Lessons were institutionalized. This created learning loops across generations rather than repeating mistakes. Persia understood that fear works short-term, but trust compounds. The system was resilient because it assumed imperfection. Persia designed its empire to survive bad years. Droughts and rebellions were expected inputs. Systems that expect chaos don't break when chaos arrives. The empire never confused expansion with strength. Control mattered more than size, because overreach is just delayed collapse. Persia avoided cultural replacement. Law was standardized, but punishment was contextual. Justice felt firm, not blind. The empire invested heavily in predictability. When people can forecast tomorrow, they stop fighting today. Stability begins where uncertainty ends. Persia treated borders as flexible membranes. Religious tolerance was mathematical. Fewer rebellions meant fewer soldiers and lower costs. The empire separated identity from allegiance. You didn't have to be Persian to serve Persia. You only had to operate within the system. Infrastructure was treated as power. Roads, canals, and storage systems mattered as much as armies. Control follows connectivity. The empire understood that violence scales poorly. Administration scales infinitely better. Bureaucracy outlasts brutality. Time was Persia's greatest weapon. While others rushed for domination, Persia built endurance. Empires don't fall suddenly. They decay quietly. The system rewarded competence quietly. Persia didn't seek to be loved. It sought to be reliable. Love fades, reliability compounds. Persia understood a truth most civilizations learn too late. People don't rebel because they hate power. They rebel because power feels unpredictable. The empire treated information as a strategic asset. Messengers, records, audits. Nothing relied on verbal trust alone. Power without data is blind. Persia assumed leaders would fail. That's why authority was layered. When one layer cracked, another absorbed the shock. No single failure was allowed to become fatal. The system normalized dissent by channeling it. Complaints had routes, timelines, and outcomes. When frustration has an exit, it doesn't explode. Persia never optimized for speed alone. It optimized for recoverability. Fast systems collapse faster. Resilient systems bend and return. Local elites were not eliminated. They were absorbed. By giving them a stake, Persia converted rivals into custodians of order. Military force was used sparingly but decisively. The threat mattered more than frequency. Overuse of violence dulls its effect. The empire designed redundancy into everything: food, governance, defense. Single points of failure were treated as existential threats. Persia understood that loyalty is transactional before it is emotional. Fair taxes, protection, and autonomy bought allegiance more reliably than fear. The system valued long memory. Records preserved lessons, mistakes, and precedents, so the empire never had to relearn pain. Persia avoided personality cults. When institutions overshadow individuals, continuity survives ambition. Economic circulation mattered more than hoarding. Wealth was allowed to move, because stagnant money breeds unrest. The empire refused to micromanage daily life. Control was exercised at the system level, not the personal level. Freedom within structure creates compliance. Persia mastered delayed gratification. It invested in outcomes generations ahead, knowing survival is a long game. Collapse was not sudden. It was gradual erosion when successors stopped maintaining the system. The lesson is clear. Resilience requires upkeep. Persia didn't fall because its ideas failed. It fell when people forgot why those ideas existed. Persia treated geography as a constraint, not a weakness. Mountains, deserts, and open plains weren't obstacles to conquer. They were realities to design around. Roads followed logic, not ego. The empire invested heavily in infrastructure long before it produced visible returns. Roads, canals, storage systems. These were not symbols of power, but tools of survival. Persia understood that time is a weapon. Faster communication meant faster correction. Delays were seen as threats equal to enemies. Instead of forcing cultural uniformity, the system standardized processes. What people believed didn't matter. How taxes were paid, laws enforced, and disputes resolved did. The empire separated ideology from administration. Faith inspired people, but paperwork ran the empire. Mixing the two was considered dangerous. Persia designed incentives before punishments. Most people complied not because they were afraid, but because cooperation paid better than resistance. Borders were treated as living systems, not fixed lines. Frontier regions were flexible buffers designed to absorb pressure, not rigid edges waiting to snap. Persia accepted that corruption would exist. Instead of pretending it wouldn't, the system limited how much damage corruption could do. Officials were rotated deliberately. Staying too long created loyalty to position instead of purpose. Movement prevented stagnation. The empire avoided over-centralization. Control was distributed just enough to remain unified without becoming brittle. Persia prioritized predictability over brilliance. A system that works every day beats a genius idea that works once. Military victories were treated as temporary advantages, not permanent solutions. Administration always followed conquest immediately. The empire believed trust was built through consistency, not persuasion. Doing the same fair thing repeatedly mattered more than speeches. Persia understood that survival is not about dominance, it's about endurance. Empires don't die when attacked. They die when they stop adapting.